here we are, open for questions, discussions, disagreements, etc., and certainly an invitation to this book for those who haven't done so yet.
I have two questions. On reading your book, I had problems in two specific concepts. The first was immanence, because throughout your book, you stress on the importance of immanence. And I suppose you do it from within the Marxist tradition, which is like a situatedness within history. And I don't know if when you say if your critique of everyday life is immanent, wouldn't that be redundant in a sense that the everydayness is already situated within history? That would be my first question. And the second concept I have problems with was posthumanism, because throughout your book you also stress the importance of like acknowledging these relationships between humans and non-humans in this interweaving of daily ecologies and environments. But I mean, you didn't like clear out your what did you mean by posthumanism? Because I mean, you mentioned that Neil Smith's thesis was criticized because his concept of posthumanism and of production of nature was like anthropomorphized. But it seems that your concept of posthumanism is like anthropomorphized too. So I would like to know what is your take on posthumanism, which I think wasn't like very much developed within your book.
Okay, yeah, thanks. So the notion of immanence, I think, Gramsci, so there's been a lot of really good work on Gramsci recently and seeking to demonstrate the specificity of his philosophy of praxis. Peter Thomas's work, and the notion that the philosophy of praxis is not simply a code word for Marxism, that the philosophy of praxis refers to Gramsci's specific development of Marxism. Peter Thomas defines Gramsci's philosophy of, well, Gramsci defines his philosophy of praxis around three terms. An absolute historicism, an absolute humanism of history, and an absolute secularization and earthliness of thought. So that is where the absolute immanence comes in. For me, Gramsci, the way in which Gramsci understands that is he seeks to historicize particular practices at particular times and seek to understand how a form of critique might emerge from within those practices. Does that make sense? But then I don't understand, so its relation to everyday life. I think the immanent critique is situated within everyday life. It is an immanent critique of everyday life. So it's a sense that our criticisms, our critique of the world in which we live comes from the day-to-day practices of making that world in which we live. Does that make sense?
Yeah, but wouldn't like everyday life be already immanent? Like, isn't that like inherent to the concept of everydayness, like that is immanent, or?
And that's the possibility for the critique. That's what I'm arguing. That the possibility is there within the practice of making the world as it is. So it is. I think the possibilities are there because of that sense of immanence. I think you could also. So this is something I'm not strong enough to be able to do, but I think you could also look at because of course there's been a lot of discussion of immanence recently around Spinoza's work and Spinoza taking immanence in a slightly different direction. And I think the Gramscian trajectory probably comes more from a Hegelian understanding of immanence. It goes off. And so I think the kind of Deleuzian discussions of immanence and the Gramscian ones go in different directions. But it might be interesting to begin to make sense by tracing it back to Hegel and Spinoza as a way of making sense of those distinct understandings of immanence. In relation to the post-humanism question, I think when writing the book, I was very conscious of the fact that one of my audiences would be a geographical audience, and that one of the criticisms of the book from the start would be that it's anthropocentric. And one of the criticisms of Smith's work and of much of the work, or some of the work within urban political ecology, would be that this builds from a problematic humanism. So when I'm looking at post-humanism within the book, firstly I seek to reject these very simplistic understandings, these very simplistic accounts of what humanism is, because it doesn't fit any of the thinkers with whom I'm dealing, or nearly all of whom are considered to be humanists in some form or other. So what I seek to do is kind of, again, push the method and say, actually, what these supposed humanists are doing is quite similar to work which post-humanists have been doing, but different in some respects, but quite similar. And the simple critiques of post-humanism of many of these humanist thinkers can be rejected. I think the post-humanism as well, if we trace that back in the present moment, we could probably also look at how some forms of post-humanism are have emerged as a kind of diluted form from Althusser's theoretical anti-humanism. So theoretical anti-humanism emerges into a kind of, it transforms into post-humanism in the present moment. But then some of the work within geography around post-humanism and the post-humanities, I think, doesn't recognise that trajectory. It doesn't see the lineages back to Althusser's theoretical anti-humanism. So I kind of wanted to get more of a conversation going. And I see that in the work of someone like Donna Haraway. I really see that, because Haraway, I think, has come from a historical materialist background. She's deeply, deeply aware of these debates. She's been leading these debates in many respects. So there, I think you find a figure within the post-humanities writing about post-humanism who seems to be doing something really quite similar to someone like Smith. And there you get some kind of a conversation. So there are different strands within this post-humanism. The kind of diluted post-humanism that seems to be circulating within geography at the moment. Post-humanism of someone like Haraway, who I think is doing some really interesting work. And also, I think the work within post-humanism and the post-humanities necessarily needs to be historicised, if you like, and seen in relation to the Althusserian legacy. Is that?
Yeah, so, I mean, what you're saying is that you try to differentiate yourself in your argument from the post-humanism that derives or draws from theories such as vitalism or agronemic theory or things like that? Is that?
Yeah, it distinguishes itself from it, but it also seeks to show that many of the simple critiques of the work that I do from the neo-vitalisms or potential critiques, I try to sort of almost disarm them before they come, I think, if that's fair. So to show that potentially what we're doing is quite similar and the differences perhaps lie elsewhere.
Yeah, thanks for your talk as well to think about it, and thanks to the party for those great questions as well, which some of will overlap with mine. And apologies if they're a bit sprawling, but yeah, and they're not a critique. It's just me trying to understand where you're coming from with your theoretical framework here. So, in reading your book, I came across, like, in thinking about how you theorize nature-society relationships and also the human-non-human, and when you were drawing on Haraway and the figure of the cyborg, and particularly in relation to the city, you sometimes drew on Latour and his theorization of these concepts, and I think sometimes in quite an approving way, but you never really spelled that out. And then in other parts of the book, there are very harsh critiques of Latour and what he was trying to do in this sense, which I don't think the readings were quite accurate, but I feel like it's there, but it's not really drawn out, and I wonder why it's not drawn out or why it's not engaged with more. And then also, I felt that there's a bit of a tension between the historical materials framework that you're using and then the immanent critique of everyday life and practice in the city, and to show, I guess, you're focused on the aesthetics and the everyday, isn't there a tension there between going back to a historical framework and then also bringing it back to the everyday? I felt that there was a little bit of a tension, and I'm not sure how to make sense of that. And I guess it's because I've never really been trained in a historical materialist background, so it's hard for me to understand really what it's bringing to the table, other than, you know, spatialize, and historicize, as you said before, which I think is important. But I think there's also a lot to be gained from the sort of post-humanist critiques and post-structuralist views of the city and nature society. And so if you could just respond to that sometime.
Okay, I think that's really helpful. With the Latour and actor network theory, I don't know the work well enough, to be honest, if I'm totally honest. I think I wanted to do more in the book around that, in part because it had been a debate which kind of dominated the period of the period when I was doing the PhD. This was, in a way, the kind of two camps. And this was, we were talking last night about the Wessex Seminar series, and there'd be this kind of the Bristol students and the Oxford students, and it was kind of silly, really. But, you know, they were doing the actor network theory, and we were doing the historical materialism. And it wasn't really like that. So I wanted to kind of speak to those debates and those conversations and suggest that perhaps we're doing something similar. My feeling is that for Latour, that it's, and these criticisms are fairly, maybe they're too easy and too common, but much of actor network theory, and I know some of the more recent stuff has been far better at it, but it's inadequately historicised. It's has no the ability to be able to historicise within that seems inadequate. It pays not enough attention to the power relations, and for me, it doesn't really say anything about the big questions that need to be answered around the capitalist society in which we live. And again, I was writing this book in the immediate period after 2008, this massive financial crisis. So this was why the debates that we'd been having around actor network theory and historical materialism in the mid-2000s, some kind of seemed irrelevant, really, to making sense of what was happening outside at that present moment. So I found myself being just drawn right back to the historical materialist work, because it was about the crisis, it was about that, and that was what was motivating where I was looking in the debates at the time. But I think I probably don't do a good enough job, and I kind of promised that to the publisher, that this would be a proper exploration of these relationships, and I don't think it is. And I'm sure you probably know, you do know far better than I where the criticisms are flawed on my part, where I have misreadings, and I'm sure you could tell me where I could probably do a much better job. In relation to the question of historicising, I think we do need to historicise forms of thought as they emerge. So I think a critique emerges within Inander at particular moments, at particular times, but this always articulates with forms of thought which have existed prior to that. So we can see that people feel deeply angered at the injustice of being disconnected from their water supply or having inadequate access to water within that particular informal settlement. But how does that relate to their understandings from the struggle years, and how their understandings of the ANC as the party of struggle? We need to see how those forms of thought articulate. We need to situate them within the specificities of South Africa and the specificities of Inander, where people have fought hard to see those ideas emerge. So I don't think we can make sense of the kind of critique which emerges in that moment unless we begin to see how it articulates with other forms of thought. And so historicising forms of thought, but also historicising practices. And that's not to reject the everyday, nor the critique which emerges within everyday life, but it's always to argue that it articulates with prior practices and prior forms of thought.
Can you go? I would like to hear more about how you understand the common sense and more in relation to the Durban case, because I think it would be good to elaborate it a little bit more with a practical example. So I want to understand what was the fragmented common sense in Durban, and also I would like to understand better if there are competing common senses or competing elements of common sense, how do they change and how could the good sense that you mentioned could emerge? Just a little bit more grounded on the example. And again, with the first example you gave, you said you're motivated by the neighbor in the flat. So I would like to know in what sense, what kind of environmental politics could connect to her common sense?
Yeah, okay. So, the common sense within Inanda. I think, again, Gramsci talks about these kind of sedimented layers that make up common sense, and again, beginning to construct an inventory of those forms of thought as they have existed within the past. So, within Inanda, I think there's a sense of a racial politics on one level, which is about interracial harmony as it emerged within the Phoenix settlement, one part of Inanda, in the late 1970s, early 1980s, but also a racial politics which has been influenced by landlord-tenant relations. So, contradictory from the start, how do people understand their subject positions in relation to constructions such as race? Also shaped by the apartheid years, that these different groups were destined for separate development. So there are contradictory layers within common sense. I think for Gramsci, the political project is to begin to provide greater coherence to the good sense, this kernel of good sense which he sees within forms of common sense. And he always relates that to practice. Again, these forms of common sense, so he talks about implicit and explicit conceptions of the world. And he talks about this implicit conception of the world, which emerges in relation to practice, which needs to be transformed into an explicit conception of the world. So the political project for Gramsci is about moving from this kind of implicit good sense to a broader conception of the world politics. It's about moving kind of along this trajectory. And crucial to this, he sees as being coherence, what he refers to as coherence. Not a kind of logical coherence about fitting ideas together logically, but about coherence understood to be the fusion of theory and practice. So how does one make explicit the conception of the world which emerges from practice? That becomes a political project which needs to be conducted on a larger scale between different social groups in order to achieve this grand politics that he talks about. Does that make sense?
So, which are these good senses in
So, for example, the critique of the tri-sector partnerships that's emerged within Inanda at that particular time. The critique, so you can find within people's, so I use an example of a protest which was these protests will be happening, I have little doubt, across Durban on an almost daily basis. But we were in one part of Inanda on one day where the water supply was no longer coming to that particular part of the informal settlement and hadn't been for 2 weeks. People had been walking up and down the road on a daily basis. Women had been carrying loads of water, men had been wheelbarrowing bucket loads of water up and charging some money to be carrying that water. I talk about, in a different chapter, I talk about how through kind of situated knowledges and through standpoint epistemologies, we might make sense of the difference between the gender division of labour, within the gender division of labour, and how one particular conception of the politics of water emerges for men who generally have been completely disassociated from the provisioning of the household with water, and the women who on a daily basis have been providing water. So what we see within this settlement is a protest which is organised, which descends on the offices of the councillor, locks the councillor in her compound until she agrees to bring in representatives from the municipal water provider. Negotiations take place. Water is provided for free for this settlement. So what is it that motivates, what is it that enables this kind of, if you like, a standpoint or this, this more radical political understanding to emerge from the women within that particular settlement that talks about a transformative politics rather than simply a survivalist politics which involves wheelbarrowing bucket loads of water up. So that kind of common sense understanding, if you like, that says we're going to confront the institutions of power and seek to change them. We're going to seek to democratise access to water and ensure that it's universalised, this free basic water which we've been denied. That would be the kind of common sense that I would think of as it exists within Ananda. But there are other moments, such as within the struggle years, such as within the marshals and their distribution of land on an incredibly equitable basis. So those kind of examples. As for the politics, the political perspectives that might emerge from Maxine's life in the flat down below, I don't know. But again, I keep asking myself, what might it mean? I really don't know. I think it would necessarily have to do with the environment of the flat in which Maxine spends large amounts of her time. I think it would be to look at the changing benefit system in relation to that. It would look to the production of that particular house, her understanding of her security within it. And it emerges, so, you know, it emerges in those mundane events like elections where we talk about the politics and who you're going to vote for and how to then build something from Maxine's frustrations of the situation in which she finds herself, but to begin to historicise the production of a social good like that flat, which now then becomes threatened. I don't know. I think it would have to be in conversation with her. I would have to learn much more from her. But those would be the starting points, I guess.
Lazaros?
Thanks very much for your talk and the book. I really enjoyed reading it. Now, I will obviously simplify what you write, so apologies for that from the beginning. Now, on the chapter on Lucas, you focus on situated knowledges and standpoint theory and how subjectivities are constructed. And you talk about cyber subjectivities and the consciousness of those subjectivities. Now moving to Gramsci and Lefebvre, my reading of it is that the philosophy of practice and everyday politics is a way to construct, to gain this consciousness, a way back to gaining consciousness of the subject who is to be the subject of this transformative politics. Now, I think that every kind of this everyday politics that is transformative at the same time challenges those pre-constructed even cyborg subjectivities. And if that is the case, and that's not really Gramscian, what's the added value of talking about how consciousness is constructed and how we gain access to consciousness or false or true consciousness, and not talking about how we challenge those forms of those standpoints where we are in. How do we move beyond the standpoint that we stand now through everyday practice in politics?
Can you say it?
As simple as I can. What I get from your chapter on subjectivity is that you construct something like a multitude in heart and naked, something that is not exactly a subject, but it is the subject where we should look for a transformative politics. And this is the cyborg subject. Now, I think that any form of transformative politics would challenge the multitude or the cyborg as such. So, what's the added value of focusing on how the cyborg or the multitude gains consciousness through everyday practice and not see how everyday practice transforms this subjectivity? Does this make sense?
I think so. It sounds brilliant. It sounds brilliant. And it seems like something which I should probably think about much, much more. I don't know, and I haven't thought about it in relation to Harta Negri, really. No. I think the way in which I'm thinking about the subject now, and the way in which I tried to frame the subject briefly within here, was to actually get rid of a notion of the subject, to some extent, through Gramsci, to think about the person and this adoption of these different personas, and how that might be related to Althusserian notions of interpolation or whatever, and how it might be related to this ensemble of social relations or socio-natural relations within a given moment. So that's kind of how I'm thinking about the person rather than the subject now. Does that...
So, yeah, but again, isn't this a construction of the person? Isn't this a pre-construction of a subject? In its multiplicity of identities, this cyborg subject, cyborg person, isn't a subject ultimately? So isn't it the worker of the 21st century? It does make the person more or less the proletariat of the 21st century, more or less. That's what I take of it.
Okay, yeah. So it is a construction, but it's a construction always in a given historical moment in relation to a broader set of social relations. So that person will change according to the set of social relations within a given moment. So the notion... The reason why I bring the cyborg into the Lukács chapter is to disrupt that notion that there is a single subject within that, and to try and to try and draw out the kind of socio-natural linkages, which now I would do probably through the Gramscian person. So I don't think it's necessarily pre-configured, it's configured in a given moment. If that makes sense.
Don't know if your research covers the subject that I will ask upon. The notion of civil society in Gramsci has been utilized, especially after the 90s, as and interpreted as noble civil society, not antagonistic, but leading to consensus, and was widely used in the ecological modernization literature. So I would like your comment on whether Gramsci's notion of civil society and its generally his work leads to antagonistic interpretations and conceptions of political action, or it could, under other readings, lead to consensual win-win political processes.
Yeah, okay. So I think you're right, yeah, Gramsci was enrolled in many debates seeking to justify forms of, Alan Meiksens would refers to it as the uses and abuses of civil society in Gramsci, that he was used and abused in various ways in relation to the debates around civil society. I think Gramsci, clearly he saw a challenge to bourgeois hegemony as crucial to his political project. This seemed to be providing, again, if we understand hegemony to be about leadership, it's about moral, intellectual leadership, which is achieved through a mixture of consent and coercion. So there's clearly a consensual element there from the start, always understood in relation to the coercive, but the consensual and the coercive are always there. As to whether it can be useful within a more antagonistic understanding, I think it's an interesting point. I think it could open the way for a more antagonistic politics, and I think Gramsci's is, on the one hand, again, the way in which he's been used and abused, that he seeks to gain lessons from the construction of bourgeois hegemony as a way of influencing his understanding of where the possibilities might lie for the construction of a proletarian hegemony. The extent to which that proletarian hegemony will be consensual and the extent to which it will build on notions of difference and perhaps what we might refer to now as dissensus. I don't know. I think there's debate there. Yeah, I think it's an interesting point.
Yeah, come on, last question.
My comment is related to the argument that now you are introducing, because I was thinking about the relation between common sense and the general society, and how the fact that common sense is built upon different layers, as you said before, and these layers are also in contradiction among each other. Looking at the relation between common sense and hegemony, you can think about a counter-hegemony. So the relation between the common sense and the hegemony is really important, according to me, to your argumentation. You should give an hint to us how you can strengthen this relation between common sense, hegemony, and a counter-hegemony that can emerge from the contradiction that we have to leverage on to have the possibility to look at new politics in the everyday practices.
Yeah. So I should place greater emphasis on that.
On the relation.
Yeah. I think
I
that's...
don't know if you do. I didn't read your book.
No.
I'm sorry. I don't know if you already did.
No, I think I should. I think I should. Yeah.
On this very happy note, which opens up the trajectory for future work, I would like to thank Alex very, very much.
There's been a lot of really good work on Gramsci recently, and seeking to demonstrate the specificity of his philosophy of praxis. Peter Thomas's work, and the notion that the philosophy of praxis is not simply a code word for Marxism, that the philosophy of praxis refers to Gramsci's specific development of Marxism. Peter Thomas defines Gramsci's philosophy of, well, Gramsci defines his philosophy of praxis around three terms. An absolute historicism, an absolute humanism of history, and an absolute secularization and earth.
Here we are, open for questions, discussions, disagreements, etc., and certainly an invitation to his book for those who haven't done so yet.
I have two questions. On reading your book, I had problems with two specific concepts. The first was immanence, because throughout your book you stress on the importance of immanence, and I suppose you do it from a Marxist, within the Marxist tradition, which is like a situatedness within history, and I don't know if...
Liness of thought. So that is where the absolute immanence comes in. For me, Gramsci, the way in which Gramsci understands that is he seeks to historicize particular practices at particular times and seek to understand how a form of critique might emerge from within those practices. Does that make sense? But then I don't understand, so its relation to everyday life. I think the immanent critique is situated within everyday life. It is an immanent critique of everyday life. So it's a sense that our criticisms...
When you say if your critique of everyday life is immanent, wouldn't that be redundant in a sense that the everydayness is already situated within history? That would be my first question. And the second concept I had problems with was posthumanism, because throughout your book you also stress the importance of acknowledging these relationships between humans and non-humans in this interweaving of daily ecologies and environments. But I mean, you didn't clear out your what did you mean by posthumanism? Because I mean, you mentioned that Neil Smith's thesis was criticized because his concept of posthumanism and of production of nature was anthropomorphized. but it seems that your concept of posthumanism is like anthropomorphized too. So I would like to know what is your take on posthumanism, which I think wasn't like very much developed within your book.
Okay, yeah, thanks. So the notion of immanence, I think, Gramsci, so